The weight of her sorrow was as tangible as the dust that clung to the hem of her black mourning dress. Clara Kensington kept her head high as she left the small cemetery at the edge of Willow Creek, the hot Arizona sun beating down on her pale skin. The year was 1883, and at 22 she was now alone in the world, having just buried her father, the last of her family. Xavier Northrop noticed her from where he stood by his horse. He'd attended the funeral out of respect, though he'd never formally met Thomas Kensington or his daughter. New to Willow Creek, Xavier had only been working at the Hayes Ranch for 3 months, but even he had heard about the respected doctor who'd saved countless lives before tuberculosis claimed his own. Clara walked with purpose, her steps quickening as she left the murmuring crowd behind. No one followed her, not the pastor who had spoken hollow words of comfort, not the townsfolk who had known her father for years. They simply watched her go, perhaps assuming she wanted solitude in her grief. But Xavier saw something in her straight shoulders and clenched fists that spoke of more than sorrow. There was fear there, and determination. Before he could think better of it, he untied his chestnut mare and followed at her respectful distance. Clara sensed the horse and rider behind her before she heard them. She'd grown up in the West you didn't survive without developing a sixth sense for when you were being followed. Without turning around, she quickened her pace, heading not toward the town but toward the small creek that gave the settlement its name. "Miss Kensington," Xavier called, keeping his voice soft. She whirled, her hand going instinctively to her waist where, in different circumstances, a weapon might have been. "Who are you?" Her voice was surprisingly steady despite the redness around her eyes. Xavier kept his distance, remaining mounted so as not to appear threatening. "Xavier Northrop, madam. I work for Mr. Hayes." "And why are you following me, Mr. Northrop?" She didn't bother to hide the suspicion in her voice. "You shouldn't be alone right now." The words came out before he could stop them. "I've been alone for longer than you know." Clara's gaze was direct, challenging. "And I don't need a stranger's pity." Xavier dismounted slowly, keeping the reins in his hand. "Not offering pity, Miss Kensington, just seems like you might be headed somewhere with purpose, and these parts can be dangerous for a person traveling alone." Clara studied him. He was tall, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of the whiskey her father used to drink on cold winter nights. His clothes were worn but clean, and he had the lean, capable look of a man who worked hard for his living. "My father's house isn't safe anymore," she said, surprising herself with the admission. Xavier didn't press, just nodded. "Where are you headed then?" "The stagecoach leaves in an hour. I intend to be on it." Clara lifted her chin slightly. "Without your belongings." Clara's composure cracked slightly. "There are men coming to collect on debts my father apparently owed. They made it clear that the house and everything in it belongs to them now." Her voice hardened. "But they won't get me," Xavier frowned. "What men? Your father was well respected." "Men from Phoenix. They arrived last night, showed papers I've never seen before, said my father borrowed money for medical supplies during the typhoid outbreak last year." She swallowed hard. "They're waiting for the funeral to end before they take possession." "Those supplies saved half the town," Xavier said, remembering the stories he'd heard since arriving. "Including Mr. Hayes's youngest boy." Clara nodded, her eyes filling with tears she stubbornly refused to shed. "My father never mentioned debts. He would have told me. Where will you go?" Xavier asked, his voice gentle. "My aunt in Denver. I haven't seen her since I was a child, but she's all I have left." Clara looked down at her dusty boots. "If she'll have me." Xavier made a decision then, one that would change the course of both their lives. "Miss Kensington, I don't believe your father was in debt, and I think you deserve the chance to prove it before you leave everything behind." Clara's head snapped up. "What are you suggesting? Give me an hour. Let me look into these men before you leave town." "Why would you help me?" "You don't even know me." Xavier smiled slightly. "Your father saved Mr. Hayes's son. In these parts, that means something." He hesitated, then added, "And no one should have to walk away from a funeral to find they've lost everything." Clara hesitated, then nodded slowly. "1 hour, Mr. Northrop, but I won't miss that stagecoach." "Fair enough." Xavier mounted his horse. "Wait for me at Martha's Cafe. Stay where people can see you." As Xavier rode toward town, Clara watched him go. wondering why she had trusted a stranger with her troubles when she hadn't even confided in the neighbors who'd known her all her life. Perhaps it was because grief made strangers of everyone, or perhaps it was something in those whiskey-colored eyes that spoke of honor in a world that suddenly seemed devoid of it. Martha's cafe was busy with the after-funeral gathering, which Clara had deliberately avoided. She slipped into a corner table, ordering coffee she couldn't afford simply to have a reason to stay. The sympathetic glances from townsfolk were almost unbearable. They knew her as the doctor's quiet daughter, the one who had assisted him in his practice since her mother's death 10 years ago. Now they looked at her as if she might shatter at any moment. Meanwhile, Xavier rode directly to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Daniels was a gruff man in his 50s who had little patience for trouble but a strong sense of justice. "These men have papers, you say?" The sheriff asked after Xavier explained the situation. "According to Miss Kensington, I haven't seen them myself." The sheriff stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Doc Kensington wasn't one to take on debts he couldn't repay, and I never heard of him dealing with anyone from Phoenix." "The timing seems convenient," Xavier pointed out, "coming the night before his funeral when his daughter is vulnerable." Sheriff Daniels nodded slowly. "I'll head over there now. You go back to Miss Kensington. Keep her safe." Xavier found Clara still at the cafe, her untouched coffee grown cold. "The sheriff's looking into it," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. "Tell me more about these men." There were two of them, well-dressed, but something about them didn't seem right. Their clothes were too fine, too new. Clara's hands trembled slightly. "They called themselves Collins and Burke, said they represented a medical supply company in Phoenix." Xavier nodded. "What kind of papers did they show you?" "A loan agreement with my father's signature." "But—" Clara hesitated. "But what?" It didn't look quite right. My father's hand was steady surgeon's hands. The signature was shaky. Xavier leaned forward. "Miss Kensington, is there anything of value in your father's house? Anything worth creating false debt to acquire?" Clara's eyes widened. "My father's medical journals, his research. He was working on a treatment for tuberculosis before he got sick himself. Research valuable enough to steal. He believed he was close to something important. He corresponded with doctors back east about it." A commotion at the cafe door interrupted them. Sheriff Daniels entered, followed by Mr. Hayes himself, a large man with a commanding presence despite his advancing years. "Miss Kensington," Mr. Hayes said, approaching their table, "I owe your father a debt I can never repay. My son William lives because of him." Clara stood, smoothing her black dress nervously. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes, but my father was just doing his job, and now it's time we do right by his memory." The rancher turned to Xavier. "Northrop, you did well bringing this to the sheriff's attention." Sheriff Daniels stepped forward. "Miss Kensington, those men aren't from any medical supply company. They're known swindlers who prey on the bereaved. They've done this in 3 counties that we know of." "Then the debt isn't real." Hope flickered across Clara's face. "No, madam, it isn't." "But they are real dangerous. They've cleared out before I could get to them, but they left this behind." He handed her a leather journal she recognized immediately as her father's research diary. "They were searching for something specific," Xavier said, watching Clara clutch the journal to her chest. "And they'll be back for it," the sheriff added grimly. Mr. Hayes placed a weathered hand on Clara's shoulder. "Which is why you'll be staying at my ranch until we sort this out." "My wife insisted." Clara looked from Mr. Hayes to the sheriff to Xavier, who offered a reassuring nod. "But the stagecoach can wait," Mr. Hayes said firmly. "Your father stood by us in our time of need. We'll stand by his daughter now." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but this time she let them fall. "Thank you," she whispered. Xavier felt something shift in his chest as he watched her, a protective instinct coupled with admiration for her strength. He'd followed her on impulse, but now he knew he would follow her anywhere she needed to go, for as long as she needed him. The Hayes Ranch sprawled across 500 acres of good grazing land, with a main house that spoke of decades of hard work and prosperity. Mrs. Hayes, a formidable woman with kind eyes, welcomed Clara with a warmth that nearly broke through the young woman's carefully constructed composure. "Your father saved my William," Mrs. Hayes said, leading Clara to a comfortable bedroom. And now you'll stay with us until those vultures are caught. Clara set her father's journal on the bedside table. I don't want to impose nonsense. This room has been empty since our daughter married and moved to California. Mrs. Hayes squeezed Clara's hand. Rest now. Dinner's at 6. Left alone, Clara finally allowed herself to collapse onto the bed, the grief she'd been holding back washing over her in waves. She cried for her father, for the home she might lose, for the uncertainty of her future. When she finally emerged from the room hours later, her eyes were swollen but her resolve was strengthened. She found Xavier on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. Mr. Northrop, she acknowledged, coming to stand beside him. Miss Kensington, he nodded, noticing the redness around her eyes but respectfully not mentioning it. Feeling any better? No, she admitted, but perhaps a bit stronger. Xavier smiled. That's often the same thing out here. Thank you for what you did today. Clara looked at him directly. You didn't have to help me. Actually, I think I did. Xavier's expression was earnest. Some things a man just knows are right. They stood in companionable silence until Mrs. Hayes called them in for dinner. The meal was a simple but hearty affair, with the Hayes family treating Clara not as an object of pity, but as an honored guest. William, the 10-year-old boy her father had saved, peppered her with questions about her father's medical work, which Clara answered with growing animation. Xavier watched her throughout the meal, noticing how her face transformed when she spoke about her father's research. There was passion there and intelligence that matched her beauty. He found himself wanting to know more about her, about the life she'd led, before grief had etched itself into her features. After dinner, Clara surprised everyone by asking to see the medical kit her father had used to save William during the typhoid outbreak. I kept it, Mrs. Hayes said. Couldn't bear to return it after what he'd done for us. The kit, when brought out, contained standard medical supplies of the day, along with several vials of medicine Clara didn't recognize. These aren't standard treatments, she murmured, examining them carefully. These are my father's experimental compounds. Xavier moved closer, interested. For tuberculosis, Clara nodded slowly. He must have brought them that day in case conventional treatments failed. Her eyes widened suddenly. And if they worked on typhoid? Then his research was further along than anyone knew, Xavier finished for her. Clara looked up at him, excitement replacing sorrow for the first time that day. This could be what those men were looking for, not just his notes but the actual compounds. Mr. Hayes frowned. Why would swindlers want medical research? Because it's valuable, Clara said. My father corresponded with pharmaceutical companies back east. If his treatment works, it could be worth a fortune. And if they stole it and sold it as their own? Xavier added. Clara nodded grimly. They could profit from my father's life's work while I'm left with nothing. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The revelation about her father's research had awakened something in her beyond grief, a determination to protect his legacy. She slipped from her bed and returned to the main room where a single lamp still burned. To her surprise, Xavier sat at the table, cleaning his revolver by the dim light. Can't sleep either, he asked without looking up. Clara shook her head, taking a seat across from him. Every time I close my eyes, I see those men rifling through my father's belongings, treating his life's work like something to be stolen. Xavier set aside the gun and looked at her directly. What will you do now? Still planning to take the stagecoach to Denver? I don't know. Clara ran her fingers over the worn cover of her father's journal, which she'd brought with her. Part of me wants to run as far as possible from the pain, but another part wants to fight. Xavier finished for her. Clara smiled faintly. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who recognizes the look. Xavier's voice softened. I've worn it myself. Something in his tone made Clara look up. You've lost someone too, Xavier nodded slowly. My entire family. Fire took our ranch in Texas when I was 19. I was the only one who survived. I'm sorry, Clara whispered, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. It was 5 years ago. Xavier looked at their hands, then back at her face. The pain changes shape, but it doesn't disappear. You just learn to carry it differently. Clara withdrew her hand, but the warmth of the brief connection lingered. How did you move forward? one day at a time, found work on ranches, kept moving. He smiled slightly. Until I came to Willow Creek and something told me to stay. Clara studied him in the lamplight, the strong lines of his face, the quiet dignity in his posture. I've never left Willow Creek, never been more than 50 miles from where I was born, and now you're considering traveling all the way to Denver, or staying to fight for what's mine. Clara opened the journal, revealing pages of her father's neat handwriting. I assisted my father in all his work. I know his methods, his thinking, if I could continue his research. Xavier leaned forward, intrigued. You have medical training, Clara laughed softly, not formally. No medical school would accept a woman, but my father taught me everything he knew. I've set bones, delivered babies, mixed medicines since I was 12 years old. So your father's work could be your future, not just his legacy, if I can protect it. Clara's expression hardened. If I can prove those men are frauds before they return. Xavier was quiet for a moment, then said, They will return, you know. Men like that don't give up easily when there's profit involved. Then I'll be ready for them. Clara's voice was steel beneath silk. With or without the sheriff's help. Xavier studied her, admiration warming his eyes. Miss Kensington, I think you're a force to be reckoned with. Clara, she said suddenly. If we're going to be allies in this fight, you might as well use my given name. Clara, Xavier repeated, liking the way it felt. And I'm Xavier to my friends. Are we friends, Xavier? She asked, a genuine question in her eyes. I'd like to be, he answered honestly. And maybe, when this is all over, something more. The boldness of his statement surprised them both. Clara blushed, looking down at the journal. You hardly know me. I know enough, Xavier said simply. I know you have courage and intelligence. I know you loved your father and honor his memory. And I know that, when I saw you walking away from that funeral alone, something told me not to let you face whatever came next by yourself. Clara looked up, meeting his gaze steadily. I've been taking care of myself for a long time. I don't doubt it. But everyone needs someone watching their back in this world. The silence between them was charged with possibility and unspoken understanding forming in the quiet of the ranch house. We should get some rest, Clara finally said, closing the journal. Tomorrow I want to return to my father's house. There may be more evidence there of what those men were really after. Xavier nodded. I'll take you, first light. As Clara rose to return to her room, she paused beside him. Thank you, Xavier, for following me today. Thank you for letting me, he replied softly. Morning broke over the mountains with a golden clarity that seemed at odds with the tension of their mission. Clara had changed from her morning dress to a simple blue skirt and white blouse borrowed from Mrs. Hayes. The clothing was slightly too large, but she had cinched it with a belt and looked ready for whatever the day might bring. Xavier waited for her on the porch, 2 horses saddled and ready. Mr. Hayes had insisted they take his best mare for Clara, despite her protests that she could ride whatever was available. You ride well, Xavier observed as they set out, noticing her easy posture in the saddle. My father believed girls should know how to ride as well as boys. Said it was practical in a place like this. Clara smiled at the memory. He taught me to shoot, too, a progressive man. He was. Pride colored her voice. He treated women the same as men at a time when most doctors wouldn't even discuss certain ailments with female patients. They rode in companionable silence, the morning air still cool before the full heat of the day set in. Willow Creek came into view, the small town just waking up as shopkeepers opened their establishments and the blacksmith's forge began to smoke. Clara's house sat on the outskirts, a modest 2-story structure with a small garden that had once been her mother's pride. As they approached, Xavier noticed Clara's hands tighten on the reins. Are you ready for this? He asked gently. She nodded, her jaw set. It's still my home, no matter what those papers said. They dismounted and tied the horses to the hitching post. Clara withdrew a key from her pocket and unlocked the front door, which swung open with a familiar creak. Inside, the evidence of the intruder's search was immediately apparent: books pulled from shelves, drawers left open, papers scattered across the floor. They were looking for something specific, Xavier said, surveying the chaos. Clara moved through the rooms with purpose, her initial shock giving way to methodical assessment. Father's study is the worst, she noted. entering the small room where her father had seen patients when they couldn't come to his office in town. The medical cabinet had been ransacked, empty vials littering the floor. Clara knelt, picking up a broken glass container, a few drops of dark liquid still clinging to the bottom. "This was his tuberculosis compound," she said, her voice tight with anger. "They took everything." Xavier examined the desk where papers had been sorted through more carefully. They knew what they were looking for. Yes, but how? Clara stood, brushing glass from her skirt. How did they know about his research? Father was cautious about who he told. Xavier frowned, thinking. "You said he corresponded with doctors back east. Could someone have leaked information? Possibly. Or," Clara's eyes widened, "his assistant in Phoenix. Father consulted with a pharmacist there about ingredients for his compounds, a man named Burke." "Burke, like one of the men who came to your house," Xavier straightened. "It could be a coincidence, but I don't believe in coincidences that convenient." Xavier moved to the window, looking out to ensure they were still alone. "Clara, we need to search for anything they might have missed. Any clue to who they really are or where they might have gone." Clara nodded, moving with renewed purpose to her father's bedroom. Unlike the study, this room had been searched less thoroughly. She went directly to a painting on the wall, a landscape of the mountains visible from their property, and removed it, revealing a small wall safe. "Father always kept his most important papers here," she explained, working the combination. "Only he and I knew about it." The safe opened with a click, revealing a stack of documents. Clara removed them carefully, spreading them on the bed. Birth certificates, deeds, her mother's wedding ring, and a sealed envelope addressed simply to Clara. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal and withdrew several papers. As she read, her expression changed from curiosity to shock. "What is it?" Xavier asked, watching her closely. "It's a patent application," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for his tuberculosis treatment. He filed it 3 months ago before he got sick." She looked up at Xavier, eyes bright with unshed tears. "He did it in my name. The patent is registered to Clara Kensington." Xavier moved closer, reading over her shoulder, "which means if his treatment works, then I own it, not whoever stole his research." Clara clutched the papers to her chest. "He was protecting me even then. He must have suspected." "That someone wanted to steal his work," Xavier finished. "The question is who?" Clara shuffled through the remaining papers, stopping at a letter with a Phoenix postmark. "This might tell us." "It's from the pharmacist, Burke." The letter was brief, but revealing Burke explaining that a representative from a pharmaceutical company in Chicago had been asking questions about Dr. Kensington's research, offering substantial sums for information. "Burke refused to tell them anything," Clara said, scanning the letter, "but he was worried enough to warn my father." She looked up at Xavier. "This is dated just 2 weeks ago." "So Burke isn't one of the men who came here," Xavier reasoned. "No, but they used his name, knowing my father would have trusted him." Clara's expression hardened. "They're imposters, using information they gathered about my father's connections to gain my trust." Xavier moved to the window again, scanning the street. "We need to take these papers to the sheriff. They're proof that those men had no legitimate claim to your father's property." Clara nodded, carefully folding the documents and tucking them into her bodice. "And we need to wire the real Burke in Phoenix. He might know who was asking questions." As they prepared to leave, a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside the bedroom. Xavier drew his revolver in one fluid motion, positioning himself between Clara and the door. "We know you're there," he called, his voice steady. "Show yourself." After a tense moment, a man appeared in the doorway, young, barely out of his teens, with nervous eyes and city clothes too fine for the dusty streets of Willow Creek. "Please don't shoot," he said, hands raised. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Who are you?" Xavier demanded, keeping his gun leveled. "My name is Samuel Reed. I work for Burke Pharmaceuticals in Phoenix." The young man swallowed visibly. "Mr. Burke sent me to warn Dr. Kensington, but I arrived too late for the funeral. When I went to the cemetery, they told me his daughter had left with a cowboy." His eyes moved to Clara. "You must be Miss Kensington." Xavier kept his gun steady. "Prove you're who you say you are." Samuel slowly reached into his jacket, withdrawing a folded letter. "I have this from Mr. Burke." Clara took the letter, reading it quickly while Xavier kept watch on the young man. "It appears genuine," she said after a moment. "It matches Burke's handwriting from his previous correspondence with my father. What's this warning about?" Xavier asked, lowering his gun slightly but not holstering it. Samuel's shoulders sagged with relief. "The men who were asking questions in Phoenix, they work for Westmoreland Pharmaceutical Company in Chicago. They've been trying to develop a tuberculosis treatment for years without success. When they heard rumors about Dr. Kensington's breakthroughs, they became insistent enough to steal research and claim false debts," Clara said grimly. Samuel nodded. "Mr. Burke believes they bribed someone at the patent office to delay your father's application while they tried to recreate his formula. When that failed, they resorted to more direct methods." Xavier finally holstered his weapon, though his posture remained alert. "Did Burke know who these men are?" "Their real names. Collins is actually named Westmoreland. He's the son of the company's founder. The other man is his associate, Jenkins." Samuel hesitated. "They're dangerous men, Miss Kensington. They've done this before to other doctors and researchers. Usually they succeed." Clara's chin lifted defiantly. "Not this time." Xavier nodded toward the door. "We need to get these papers to the sheriff. You too, Reed. Your testimony could be important." As they left the house, Clara paused on the porch, looking back at the home where she had grown up. "I never thought I'd be fighting to save my father's legacy the day after burying him," she said quietly. Xavier placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're not fighting alone." The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, 3 riders coming fast down the road toward the house. "Inside now," Xavier ordered, recognizing the lead rider as one of the men who had been pointed out to him earlier as the false creditors. They retreated into the house, Xavier locking the door behind them. "Is there a back way out?" he asked Clara. She nodded, already moving toward the kitchen. "Through the garden. There's a gate that leads to the alley." Outside, the riders dismounted. "Miss Kensington," a cultivated voice called, "I know you're in there. We have unfinished business to discuss." Xavier guided Clara and Samuel toward the back door. "Go, get to the sheriff." "I'll hold them off." Clara stopped, her eyes flashing. "I'm not leaving you here to face 3 armed men alone." "This isn't a debate, Clara." Xavier's voice was firm. "Those papers you're carrying are the key to stopping them. They need to reach the sheriff." Clara hesitated, torn between the logic of his argument and her unwillingness to abandon him. Finally, she nodded. "Be careful." "Always am," he replied with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. As Clara and Samuel slipped out the back door, Xavier positioned himself near a front window, revolver ready. The men outside were spreading out, preparing to force their way in. He recognized their type men who used fine clothes and educated accents to disguise the violence at their core. "We just want what's ours, Cowboy," the leader called Westmoreland if Samuel's information was correct. "The girl can keep the house. We only want the research." Xavier remained silent, watching their movements through a gap in the curtains. 3 against 1 weren't odds he liked, but all he needed to do was buy time for Clara to reach the sheriff. The front door suddenly splintered under the impact of a boot, and Xavier fired a warning shot into the doorframe. "Next one won't miss," he called. "The sheriff's already been notified about your fraud. Best ride out while you still can." A bullet shattered the window near Xavier's head, sending glass flying. He ducked, moving to another position as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. These men weren't here to negotiate, they'd come to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. Clara and Samuel had just reached the end of the alley when the shooting started. Clara stopped, her face pale as she looked back toward her home. "We have to keep going," Samuel urged. "Your cowboy knew what he was doing." "His name is Xavier," Clara said, her voice tight with worry, "and I'm not leaving him to die for my father's research." Before Samuel could stop her, she was running toward the sheriff's office, determination in every step. Sheriff Daniels was skeptical at first, even with the evidence of the patents and Burke's letters. "Patent disputes are civil matters, Miss Kensington, not criminal." The sound of gunfire in the distance cut him off. "That's criminal enough," Clara snapped. "They're attacking a man who was only trying to help me." The sheriff's expression changed. "Wait here," he ordered, reaching for his shotgun. "No," Clara's voice was steel. "Those men are after my father's research. I'm coming with you." The sheriff looked like he wanted to argue but recognized the futility. "Stay behind me," he finally said, then turned to his deputy. "Round up any men who can shoot straight. We've got trouble at the Kensington place." Back at the house, Xavier was pinned down in the doctor's study. He'd taken a graze to his left arm but had managed to wound one of the attackers in return. The leader, Westmoreland, was becoming increasingly frantic. "Burn it down," Xavier heard him shout. "If we can't have the research, no one will," Xavier grimaced. If they set fire to the house, he'd have no choice but to make a run for it directly into their line of fire. He checked his ammunition, 3 bullets left, not enough for a prolonged standoff. The smell of smoke reached him moments before he saw flames licking at the curtains in the front room. They tossed a torch through the broken window. Xavier backed toward the rear of the house. Knowing his time was running out outside, Clara arrived with the sheriff and 6 armed townsmen just as smoke began to billow from the front windows of her home. "Xavier." She screamed, starting forward only to be held back by the sheriff. "Hold your fire," Sheriff Daniels called to the men surrounding the house. "Westmoreland, Jenkins, you're surrounded. Throw down your weapons." For answer, gunfire erupted from the side of the house. The sheriff pushed Clara behind the cover of a water trough as he and his men returned fire. The exchange was brief but intense, ending when one of the attackers cried out in pain. "I'm hit," a voice shouted, not Westmoreland's, Clara noted with grim satisfaction. "Surrender now." The sheriff called again. "There's no way out." Clara's attention was fixed on the house, which was now engulfed in flames at the front. "Xavier," she whispered, fear clutching at her heart. Had she escaped one loss only to face another? Then, through the smoke at the back of the house, a figure emerged, dragging another behind him. Xavier, his face blackened with soot, pulled the wounded Westmoreland out of the burning building. "He tried to go back for the research," Xavier explained between coughs as deputies rushed forward to take custody of the injured man. "Got caught when part of the roof collapsed." Clara ran to Xavier, heedless of the deputies and townsfolk watching. She threw her arms around him, holding him tightly despite the soot that transferred to her borrowed clothes. "You could have been killed," she admonished, her voice muffled against his chest. Xavier's good arm wrapped around her, holding her close. "Couldn't let your father's home burn without trying to save something," he murmured. The sheriff approached, looking grim. "Jenkins is dead," he reported. "The one who was wounded earlier, is in custody. Westmoreland here will live to face charges." Clara finally stepped back from Xavier, though she kept close to his side. "What about my father's research? His medical supplies?" Xavier shook his head regretfully. "The fire spread too quickly. I couldn't save much." He reached into his shirt, withdrawing a singed leather-bound book. "Just this." Clara took the book with trembling hands, her father's personal journal, different from his research notes. It contained not scientific observations, but his thoughts, his hopes, his love for his daughter written in his own hand. In many ways, it was worth more than any patent. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the journal to her heart. As the townspeople organized a bucket line to prevent the fire from spreading to neighboring buildings, Clara watched her childhood home burn. Yet strangely, the despair she had felt at the funeral seemed distant now. In its place was a new emotion, determination, mixed with something else she wasn't yet ready to name when she looked at Xavier. "What will you do now?" Xavier asked quietly, standing beside her as the flames gradually subsided. Clara looked down at the patent papers, still safely tucked in her bodice. "I still have the legal rights to my father's treatment, and I have his knowledge here." She touched her temple. "I assisted him in every step of his research. I can recreate it." Xavier studied her face, admiring the resolve he saw there. "That won't be easy. Few worthwhile things are." Clara turned to face him fully. "But I won't be leaving on the stagecoach tomorrow. My father's work is here, and so is his legacy. So am I." Xavier smiled, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at the makeshift bandage Clara had insisted on applying to his arm. "I'm glad to hear it. I'll need help," Clara continued. "I'll need to establish my own practice, convince people to trust a woman with their medical care." "The Hayes family will stand behind you," Xavier said confidently. And so will I if you'll have me. Clara's eyes softened as she looked at him. You followed me from a funeral without asking, faced down armed men for a woman you barely knew, and nearly died saving my father's journal. I think I'd be a fool not to have you by my side, Xavier Northrop. In the days that followed, Clara indeed stayed in Willow Creek, initially as a guest of the Hayes family, but soon establishing herself in a small office near where her father had practiced. The town was skeptical at first of a female doctor, but those who had known her father gave her a chance. When she successfully treated Mrs. Patterson's difficult childbirth and saved both mother and baby, word spread quickly of the doctor's daughter, who had inherited not just his knowledge but his compassion. Xavier remained at the Hayes Ranch, but spent most of his free time helping Clara rebuild her life. He constructed shelves for her medicines, built an examination table, and rode with her when she made house calls to remote homesteads. Their friendship deepened with each passing day, their shared experience of loss and resilience forming a bond neither had expected but both treasured. 3 months after the funeral, Clara received a letter from a pharmaceutical company in San Francisco, expressing interest in manufacturing her father's tuberculosis treatment once she had recreated and tested it. The letter came with an offer of partnership rather than purchase. They would provide the facilities and distribution while she would oversee production and quality, maintaining control of her father's legacy. It's more than I ever hoped for, she told Xavier that evening as they sat on the porch of her new small house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar gold and purple hues. You deserve it, Xavier replied simply. Your father would be proud. Clara studied his profile in the fading light, the strong jaw now familiar to her, the eyes that had first caught her attention on the worst day of her life. I couldn't have done it without you, she said softly. Xavier turned to her, his expression serious. You could have. You're the strongest person I know, Clara Kensington. Perhaps, but I'm grateful I didn't have to. She hesitated, then added, when you followed me that day, I thought you were intruding on my grief. I didn't realize you were offering me a future. Xavier reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. I didn't know it myself. I just knew I couldn't let you walk away alone. Clara leaned toward him, her free hand coming to rest on his cheek. I'm glad you didn't. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise exchanged in the quiet of the evening. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Clara. I think I have since I saw you standing so brave and alone at that cemetery. I love you too, she whispered back. Thank you for following me into this new life. 6 months later, they were married in a simple ceremony at the Hayes Ranch, with the entire town in attendance. Clara wore a dress of pale blue instead of traditional white, a color her father had always said matched her eyes, and carried wildflowers gathered from the hills surrounding Willow Creek. By then, her medical practice was flourishing, and the first batch of her father's tuberculosis treatment was being produced in San Francisco under her supervision. She had traveled there twice to oversee the process, Xavier accompanying her on the journey that had once seemed so daunting when she'd planned to flee to Denver alone. After the ceremony, as friends and neighbors celebrated around them, Xavier led Clara away from the crowd to a quiet corner of the Hayes garden. I have something for you, he said, withdrawing a small package from his pocket. Clara unwrapped it carefully to find a silver locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of her father, smiling in a way she remembered well from her childhood. How did you? She began, tears welling in her eyes. Mrs. Hayes had it. Your father gave it to her after he saved William, said she might want a reminder of the doctor who treated her son. Xavier clasped the locket around Clara's neck. I thought you should have it back. Clara touched the locket reverently, then looked up at her husband. It's perfect. Now I can carry him with me always. Xavier smiled, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. He's always been with you in everything you do, in the lives you save, in the work you continue. Clara leaned into his embrace, feeling the strength that had supported her through the darkest days of her life. And now I have you beside me as well. Always, Xavier promised, sealing the vow with a kiss as the sun set on their wedding day, painting the world in the same colors they had watched together the day they began their journey from grief toward love. 2 years after their wedding, Clara and Xavier stood on the porch of their home, a comfortable 2-story house built on land purchased from the Hayes family. It was larger than her father's house had been, with a dedicated space for Clara's medical practice and room for the family they hoped to have. Clara leaned against the railing, her hand resting on her slightly rounded stomach, watching as Xavier taught a local boy how to properly groom a horse. The scene filled her with contentment, a feeling she had once thought lost forever when she walked away from her father's funeral. "Dr. Northrop," a voice called, and Clara turned to see a rider approaching at a gallop. Though she had kept the Kensington name professionally to honor her father's legacy, she had taken Xavier's name in their personal life. Hearing it still gave her a thrill of belonging. "What is it, Jimmy?" she called, recognizing the Hayes Ranch hand. "It's Mrs. Peterson's time," the young man reported breathlessly. "The baby's coming early," Clara nodded, already turning to collect her medical bag. "Tell her I'm on my way." Xavier approached, having heard the exchange. "I'll saddle the horses," he said, giving her a quick kiss before heading to the stable. Within minutes, they were riding toward the Peterson homestead, Clara's medical bag secured to her saddle. As they crested the hill that overlooked Willow Creek, Clara reined in her horse for a moment, looking at the town spread out below them. "Sometimes I still can't believe how different everything is from that day," she said, her voice carrying on the clear air. Xavier pulled his horse alongside hers. "Which day?" "The day of the funeral. When I thought I had lost everything." Clara turned to him, her eyes bright with purpose rather than tears. "Now I have a home, a practice, a husband, a child on the way, a future I never imagined possible." Xavier reached across the space between them, taking her hand. "All because you were brave enough to stay and fight for what was yours." Clara squeezed his hand, smiling. "And because a cowboy was kind enough to follow a grieving woman without asking." They rode on toward their patient, side by side as they had been since that fateful day, two people who had found each other in the midst of loss, and built a love strong enough to carry them through whatever lay ahead. The future stretched before them like the western horizon, full of promise and possibility, a legacy of healing and hope that had begun with a simple act of compassion on the day Clara walked away from the funeral alone.